Thank you. My name's Tim Park. I work for Wellington City Council as the Environment Partnership Leader in a team of people within our Park Sport and Recreation business unit. My background is an ecologist, and we have been really supported by our politicians, including by Celia, who's with us on the call today, is one of our former mayor, who was really supportive in us developing and expanding our work in this space. So today I'm going to talk a bit about our plan, our strategy and our plan to restore, protect and connect people with nature in Wellington, and in more detail on one of the larger projects that's come out of it. Just as a next slide please, Carla. So this was New Zealand before humans arrived a few hundred years ago. So a land of forest and birds, basically. We didn't have any mammalian predators. So as well as the next slide, massive forest loss that you can see in contrast to those two slides. We've also lost a lot of our birds and lizards and other life that lives in our native forest areas as a result of these mammalian predators. So we've lost a huge amount of our lowland forest. Pretty much only about 1% of our pre-human forest remains in Wellington City, which is on the left-hand side and partly obscured in this image, but this gives you a context for the work we're doing. Within, next slide please, Carla. Within what the Wellington City Council organisation, we deliver a lot of services to our community, and a lot of those are around active recreation and restoring nature and looking after water and waste, as a lot of other municipal organisations are. Next slide. Specifically in our green spaces, we've got hundreds of kilometres of trail network, which we're constantly adding and improving to. We have a world-class botanic gardens, over 100 active community groups working in our parks and gardens, and that's growing now to over 140. And we plant around 100,000 native trees per year that are grown in our own native plant nursery. So to bring all this work together, we developed a biodiversity strategy and action plan that was published in 2015 with the tenets that I mentioned before: protect, restore, connect and research. I'm hopefully on that right slide, Carla. I can't see. Slide 6. So next slide. So in terms of protect, we've got about 4,500 hectares of open space. So that's slide 7. And that's made up of the outer green belt, the town belt, and a number of other suburban and coastal reserves. The town belt, which is in the inner city area, surrounds the CBD and nearby suburbs, was an initial planning measure done by the founding fathers of the city to contain the city and allow green space close to the city. The outer green belt is the area beyond, which is basically almost the city limits between the urban and the rural land. Next slide, onto the weeds. So one of the big problems we face in our reserves is, and wider, is introduced or alien invasive weeds. We're doing a lot of work to control those in a prioritised manner, looking after those most significant ecological areas first, and then trying to contain their spread into other places. We're working, the next slide, we're working with our partners, regional partners and national partners, on biocontrol to have a more sustainable approach to some of these invasives in the longer term. As I mentioned, sorry about the graphic nature of the slide, on slide 10, these are the two of the big problem predators that we have in New Zealand. On the left is the Australian brush-tailed possum. On the right is the a ship rat, or Rattus rattus, which was also introduced to New Zealand. Both of them are responsible for a significant decline in our native bird population. We estimate that there's 25 million native birds are killed every year by these species. So to control them, we have a network of bait stations and trapping throughout our city reserves and increasingly into our urban environment. In the last 5 or so years, we've seen a huge increase in our community engagement in trapping and controlling pests in our reserves as well. Next slide to 13. We're trialling new technologies such as this gas-powered trap, which is a local business based in Wellington that's self-resettable to control rats and stoats in our reserves. This trap basically can keep killing and resets itself, so it doesn't require as much maintenance from the community. We also do it, next slide, onto the Kiwi sign. We're doing a lot of raising awareness of the changing nature of our cities in terms of the wildlife coming back. We've seen significant increases, over 100-fold increases in a number of our bird species as a result of our control work in the city, and also Zealandia, which I didn't mention, as the source site of a lot of these areas, which is a predator-free sanctuary that doesn't have has a fence around it to prevent possums, rats, and stoats and mustellards getting in. Next slide to 15. We're also working on issues such as water-sensitive urban design and working to try and include those in any of our civic redevelopment projects and those of developers working in sites in the city. Next slide, and that includes making sure that there's fish passage for our native species through our waterways, and improving, reducing the amount of sediment from development getting into those waterways, and improving our old sewage network, which is another pollution problem in the city. Next slide, on to 17. We're also working with our animal control officers around how we change behaviour with dogs in our reserves and other areas. Our cities are changing in that we've got a lot more native birds now living in our reserves, and a lot of these areas are on-lead dog areas, and we have very limited off-leash dog areas for people to exercise their dogs. So we're looking at ways to increase awareness of the importance to have dogs on leash in our general reserves. Next slide, we're also looking at cats and how we might be able to support our communities to be better, more responsible pet owners. We know they're a significant predator, but they are also loved ones for families. So raising awareness of their impacts, and also that they do roam. So next slide to 19, Carla, please. You can see this is a radio tracked cat, the one you saw in the previous picture, the ginger cat, and the owner didn't think the cat actually left his cat the couch. And it is an average cat, and this is where it went. So it did range quite widely, and it's just people aren't aware how far the cat does travel, and the impact that these are having collectively on our native ecosystems. But because they are a part of a family, we need to focus on positive messaging around being responsible for your pet. And so we've had some rules go in place to require all pet owners to have their cats microchipped as a step towards understanding and managing the cat populations into the future. So the next tenet of our strategy is restore. So there's two photos. This is slide 20. Carla, are taken before and after of one of our community groups planting and restoring natural forest and vegetation back to a stream in Korori. These plants have come, next slide, have come from our Burumpo nursery, where we grow up to 100,000 native trees every year, which are eco-sourced, which means the plants seeds have been collected from native forest areas within the city to ensure that their genetic material is local varieties. And next slide, and again, next slide. This is one of the projects being implemented above the city of Wellington. You can see our lovely harbour and behind, which can still swim in, thankfully. Next slide. This is one of our native forest areas, which are really diverse. So most of them have over 500 species of plant and animal that live in them. So quite diverse, sort of subtropical forest and temperate forests. Next slide. So the community environment groups that I mentioned. So these groups are planting tens of thousands of trees every year, and also getting involved in controlling invasive alien plants and predator control, as I mentioned, and also doing reintroductions and monitoring of that. Next slide. Our support for those groups has grown significantly over the years. Now that we have 4 advisory staff in our urban ecology team and about 5.5 rangers to support these community groups planting and restoring our reserves. Next slide, you can see how that grow. That slide 27 colour, how that's grown over the years in terms of our response and commitment to them. The types of groups that we have. Next slide 28. We can see conservation volunteers in restoring an area in our town belt. Working with volunteers to do that. Next slide, and also a lot of our planters and restoration groups are retired people who work in our reserves, supported by their neighbours and other people. We also, next slide, slide 30, we also do a lot of work with schools planting. And next slide, we're also investigating ways to support native species in our reserves as they expand out from Zealandia sanctuary. And trialling things like veterinarisation to create cavities for these cavity nesting birds, which is a limiting factor in terms of their habitat in the city, because our forests aren't that old, as you know. Next slide. We're also looking at supporting our community groups to allow birds like this little penguin, it's the smallest penguin in the world, to have safe nesting spaces in our coastal areas. And how are we getting people involved in this? Next slide, slide 33. We are looking at removing barriers for people to connect with nature. We're integrating into urban design in the middle of our cities, and we're improving those experiences when people go to those places through interpretation and better storytelling. Next slide. So we've developed a walkways guide to highlight the most popular walks in the city, which we're really lucky to have. And we're promoting that over the summer, normally through a campaign called Valley Walks, which we use social media to promote people walking our reserves. Next slide. This is the fern ball from our centre of the heart of our city, the Civic Square, Tinako. So a lot of our public art and urban design is inspired by nature. And we continue to support that in the way that nature, the story of nature is told in our city, and reinforcing us as an identity of the city. Next slide, so interpretation. We're telling the stories of some of these species and their significance in our urban spaces. Next slide, this is a pop-up forest that we did a few years ago. We brought a couple of thousand trees into the city and transformed pavement into a forest for the day, and even had a little trail through it. This raised people's awareness around getting into nature, and it was really surprising for a number of commuters to turn up overnight. The next slide, this is a collaborative project we did around raising awareness of weeds. So we used the beauty of some of these weeds to tell a more sinister story of them invading some of our natural spaces, by putting these posters or banners up in some of our native forest and more highly visited botanical gardens, as well as our National Museum. We have we put them in there as well. Next slide to 39. We're also doing a lot of work on social media. How are we doing for time? I'll just keep going. So yeah, we're doing a lot of raising awareness of our native species through social media and wider campaigns across the city. Slide 40. These are some of the species that we have returning to the city. The saddleback, the one on the top right, black with the orange back, a couple of years ago nested for the first time outside a predator-proof area in 100 years. So these changes are really significant for the city. Now I'm going to talk about predator-free Wellington. This is next slide, 41. This is a collaborative project between three organisations: the Next Foundation, Greater Wellington, and Wellington City Council. Next slide. This shows you the diagram, and these organisations are working together and are also co-funded by Predator Free 2050, which is a national fund to support predator control projects nationally. We've got a whole lot of other partners that we're working with. Next slide, 44. These are the broader outcomes that we've identified in terms of the partnership. So going to a zero predator state to allow nature to flourish with native wildlife. And we are hoping that will inspire other communities in New Zealand and globally to address their ecological challenges and remove some of the invasive species to allow nature to return. This has been a really huge, next slide, a huge community response to this project, and we've got pretty much all of our suburbs now have got community-led trapping programs in backyards, and we've got now those numbers are a bit out of date, but with over 35,000 pests have been caught in the city, and there's over 6,500 traps set by the community in our parks and backyards. Next slide. This has all been fueled through our community online and through Facebook and through the website, Predator Free Wellington website, which Carla's got a link to. She will share on Zoom. Next slide. But predominantly, it's been led by the community, and we've been supporting those community groups to work with the community themselves, be the face of this project, and engage the local community to manage invasive species as a collective. Next slide. So lots of amazing stats coming in about effort and the response of wildlife and the numbers of pests being caught. Next slide. So now we've got a pretty amazing coverage of our urban environment and reserves, and also our rural areas now, which I'll talk about shortly in terms of another project, Capital Kiwi. Also, next slide, slide 50. We're also working with schools to not necessarily front foot the predator-free message around trapping animals, but also how do we protect nature, and working with them around the trapping test as a rational response to protect nature and remove threats that nature is facing. Next slide. So we also do monitoring of pests in the Miramar Peninsula leading up to the operation which is planned for this winter. Next slide. And so we've got lots of groups working in our reserves. We've got lots of groups trapping in our backyards. A huge proportion of our resident population support the project, and now we've got staff on the ground in the project area where we're looking to eradicate rats, stoats and mustellards this winter. We're going into winter here in Wellington. And next slide to the operational plan. So citywide, we'll continue supporting trapping in our reserves and continue to support predator-free communities trapping. And we're also looking at subsidising people to change the way they're managing their compost, because that is actually a significant source of food for the rat population. In terms of the eradication plan, the engagement's underway, and the operation is happening this winter, and a plan for incursion response is also being developed. Next slide to Capital Kiwi. So this is a community project that's looking at bringing Kiwi back, our national icon, to the city. It is locally extinct, the Kiwi in Wellington, and the plan is to eradicate, next slide, stoats from our rural area, which is around 20,000 hectares, and setting one trap every 5 hectares in that area. So around 4,000 traps going out into that rural area. Next slide to bring back our national bird. So once the stoats are removed, there are plans to reintroduce or translocate Kiwi back into the city, where it hasn't been in probably over 100 years. I'll finish there. So hopefully we've got some time for discussion.